Society in Cambridge, and our paper is about representation of future people here in the UK. And the starting point for our paper is basically that we assume that everyone wants future people to exist, right? Which seems fairly controversial. Like, it's a worthy policy goal that the human race will continue, and future people, whether 50 or 200 or many more years from now, probably need a decent, minimally decent standard of living. And there are lots of reasons for, obviously, optimism and hope in this regard, because the human race has a lot of potential to exist well into the future. So if you don't agree with this basic premise, well, let's talk it over at lunch. But the problem is our current political systems are not set up well to deal with future generations in the decisions that we make today. And the key question that we are answering is, how can we do this better here in the UK? And we're thinking about this problem not only in the context of, say, environmental issues, which have been maybe the main context for discussing future generations thus far, but also in the context of catastrophic and existential risks. And so, as a brief primer, global catastrophic risk can basically be defined as a risk of an event or process that would end the lives of approximately 10% or more of the global population, or do comparable damage, and a subset of these are existential risks, which would effectively end the human race. Now, this sounds a bit alarmist or scary or maybe irrational, but many researchers think that these risks are something to be taken seriously. There's a lot of work being done on how to understand them, how to mitigate them, and a useful distinction can be made here between ongoing risks, which we generally understand quite well. These are risks that have existed for quite a while, that could potentially occur in any given year, not to scare anyone, but like pandemics, nuclear risks. But then we also have emerging risks, which are risks that are not so likely to occur right now, but may become significantly more likely in the future. The main one of these is catastrophic climate change, but we also have risks arising from emerging technologies, which are much less well understood, and that researchers are significantly more worried about. And so we want to reduce and manage these risks. But unfortunately, as we know, our political system is primarily focused on the short term. This is completely understandable, given electoral pressures and so on, and the natural human tendency to focus just on what's immediately before us. But if we want to effectively manage these, intergenerational risks, there's a real challenge here, and our system isn't dealing with it adequately. So we think that somehow formally representing future generations in policymaking today, although not a complete answer, could help to address some of these problems. And future people obviously cannot vote, they cannot directly participate, so we need to think of other ways to take their interests into account. And Mark's going to talk about them.
So happily, this kind of policy initiative isn't unprecedented. A number of nations have already set up institutes for representing future interests around the world. 6 of the most relevant institutes we've examined in our paper are the Finnish Committee for the Future, the Hungarian Commissioner for Future Generations, the Israeli Committee for the Future, the Singaporean Centre for Strategic Futures, and within the UK, the Scotland Future Forum and the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations. So these institutions come in a variety of different forms, and they significantly differ in many important respects. For example, in terms of institutional structure and the relation of these institutes to government, some are closer than others. So we see that Finland and Israel take the form of a parliamentary committee within Parliament, whereas in Singapore, the Centre for Strategic Futures is situated in the Prime Minister's office at the heart of government. By contrast, you can see that Hungary, Singapore, Wales, or Hungary, Scotland, Wales are slightly more independent. So Scotland's Future Forum actually is a arm's length company from the Scottish Government. Two other variables which are important in assessing these institutions are the scope of issues which these institutions focus upon, and also the functions and powers that have been delegated to them. So the research and advisory role of the government on long-term sustainability issues and things like that is fairly common across these institutions, though some have been given more substantive powers. For example, the Hungarian Commissioner had an obligation to receive and investigate complaints from the general public on things like environmental matters and stuff like that. And they also had the power to use police enforcement to back up the recommendations against, say, activities which were damaging the environment. Similarly, the Israeli Commissioner had the ability to initiate and even have a de facto veto against legislation in the Israeli Knesset. However, these latter two institutions, which were given substantive powers, only lasted for a few years after their inception. They were abolished for a number of political reasons, but many commentators have suggested that one of the major reasons why they disappeared was these extensive powers they have, and maybe a perceived lack of legitimacy on the part of these institutions. In terms overall in our whole policy analysis, we still find that institutions with minimal powers could have a great effect. So, for example, the Finnish Committee had great impact on legislation through the Finnish Parliament, through yearly recommendations and reports, even without those substantive powers to enforce the recommendations used in place or anything like that, or substantive legislation. So these are 5 key factors which we find are particularly important, and something I'd like to point out is public support and external engagement. So these institutions are novel, and this whole idea about thinking about the long-term future in policy making it's not pervasive through policy making today. So if you create these institutions, you need to engage with people to explain what they're about, and also so they seem legitimate, and they're not going to follow that trend being abolished like Hungary or Israel. Also, accessibility and transparency is also related to that, external engagement. Having the right degree of independence is also important, both in terms of the institution being able to set the whole scope of issues that they want to focus upon, and also trying to mitigate the risk of abolishment. And finally, in terms of powers, it is about giving them enough power that they have an effect on decision making in government, but it does have to be proportional to their perceived legitimacy by the decision makers. Otherwise, they risk being marginalised in favour of present interests.
So we did this massive analysis, which is helpful in a lot of ways because of all the lessons that we can draw, but clearly we also just can't transpose something from, say, Israel to the UK. And there are a few factors that influence what we might do here. Firstly, we think it's pretty clear that we need something that can be supported by all parties. And of course, as we already mentioned, the powers of an institution are a factor, but it's also important that whatever mechanism we recommend is procedural rather than recommending, for instance, how best to deal with these risks, or how best to support future generations. And there's a lot of room here for there's a lot of scope for different views, which are all valid. But it's also clear, happily, that there is a wide scope here for agreement, because in all kinds of different cross-partisan conversations, we do actually see a concern for future people in Britain, like in debates about national austerity, debt, austerity, climate change. Future generations are consistently a feature of these conversations. And we've also seen a substantial amount of support from non-state organisations, most notably the Alliance for Future Generations in recent years. There are a couple of relevant bodies which have existed in the UK that we need to consider. One of these is the STC, and that existed up until 2010. You can say that it was relevant for future generations, but it was abolished for a range of reasons. But one lesson that we can perhaps draw is that it wasn't sufficiently independent. There's also the Environmental Audit Committee, which used to monitor the policies of government departments with respect to environmental issues, and it's just important to think about why these don't exist anymore. But we should go into recommendations. So we have 3 major recommendations that we're presenting today. Our first recommendation is to form an APPG, or an all-party parliamentary group. Essentially, an APPG is a group of MPs from different parties who come together to promote a particular issue or to influence policy in some way. And we think, if done well, an APPG on future generations could help enhance cross-party support and give these issues more exposure. This approach has the advantage of being relatively easy to institute because all you need is 10 interested MPs, 10 MPs. So we think it would be a useful platform to start with. The challenge, of course, is because there are quite a lot of APPGs in existence, and some of them obviously do a lot more than others. It would be to make actually things happen with it, which would require enough support and capacity, perhaps from external organisations. And that brings me to point 2. We think that an expert advisory panel would be a really good idea, because there's a wealth of expertise here in the UK, and I've just listed a few institutes up there, both in the academic realm and elsewhere. And institutionalising this would really help enrich our policy making today. And we see that in the best cases elsewhere, there are actually strong partnerships with outside organisations. 2 options for making this could be either in the form of a non-departmental public body. We've seen effective examples in the past here, like the Committee on Radioactive Waste Management, which did some really effective things, and was also an expert advisory panel. Or another alternative structure is a policy advisory group. And our third recommendation is for a joint committee on future generations. This is more of a medium-term idea and requires more effort to establish, but would ultimately be worthwhile to formalise. And we think that the Joint Committee on Human Rights is a really good precedent here. Essentially, that committee scrutinises all of the bills passing through the houses, and for their compliance with human rights, or in our case, the interests of future generations. This is a recommendation which would need more development in the future to develop how it would work exactly. So this concludes our recommendations. If you're interested, please read our full report, which includes more context, analysis, and also recommendations, which are more minor and we haven't presented here today. And if you have any comments or questions which you don't get to ask today, please contact us. We'd really love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Now we have Dr. from the King's think tank to give us his presentation about working towards a low carbon future.